All right. Uh, hello, Matt. How are you?
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Cheers to you. Um, and wow, really excited about um, really excited about today's reading, today's discussion, for a number of reasons. You know, as I mentioned earlier, this chapter is, on the one hand, a reminder to us, as I see it anyway, that we are on track. I feel as excited about the words in this chapter and the ideas uh, that this chapter conjures as I typically feel when I discover something. When something is exciting and new to me, when I feel a kind of an epiphany. So I'd like to begin today's discussion with that in mind. And I guess before we get started, Matt, just want to just want to touch base. We've been away from our discussion for a couple weeks, and so just how you doing? How's everything? How's your poetry, etc.?
Things are going well. I've been working very hard on putting together the follow-up manuscript to Mowing These Grass. I've been working on a manuscript called City on the Second Floor,
Oh,
which very much is drawn from kind of some concepts out of I guess what we call Marxist geography,
yeah.
kind of looking at space and how what we're talking about when we talk about, and I don't want to sound like I'm being like postmodern or anything. I'm talking about space, but we're really talking about
Postmodern poet. I'm just
well, yeah,
kidding.
but it's really about like how like these things we're describing don't happen on the moon or in space or
Yeah, yeah,
floating throughout the pages of history. They happen like in places in
yeah,
spaces and like in rooms and in
yeah,
cities and in streets. Like these are things that happen on a day-to-day basis, and they're so commonplace to us that they're actually invisible.
yeah.
And so that's kind of what the book is largely about. There's some other stuff in there. And goes on a few tangents, has a little, because if I, it'd be boring if it didn't. But for the most part, it's really focused on how cities are set up to exploit people.
Yeah, well, I'm well, you know that I'm especially interested in and impatient to read it. So I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to that book. Anyway, so I'd like to begin discussion then with something that I put together this morning in preparation for our discussion about the stuff of this book and the stuff of this chapter concerning necessary labor and labor power on the one hand, and surplus labor and surplus value on the other hand. And the introduction goes like this. The more I read Marx and about Marx, the more I am fascinated by his perseverance and eclecticism. In the face of political persecution, torment in his family life, suffering of health, he turned to a wide variety of sources for learning and synthesis. Consider the first chapters that we have read to this point. Not only do they review, critique, and expand upon historiography, anthropology, economics, and philosophy, but they draw on Shakespearean drama and prose to coalesce seemingly disparate and distinct intellectual traditions so as to synthesize about the course of human social and economic development. It is upon this existing admiration that I discover Marx's mathematical manuscripts. They represent a truly significant set of understandings about capital and its bearing on our lives. But there's an added dimension here that is particularly bright to me. It is rooted in my difficulties as a Chicano student with grammar, inductive and deductive logic, and even Chicana and Chicano students' general exclusion from these subjects throughout the educational pipeline. without getting too much into it at this particular moment, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised that there is a general difficulty, a general illiteracy, if you will, um, that Chicana and Chicano students experience uh, in relation to subjects such as algebra and other higher forms of math. This dimension then and its significance is broad as it is deep. And really, I can speak about this in a variety of introductory and preliminary ways. In communication with colleagues, I shared about the Marxist materialist method. I'm, uh, there's something that I want to share. Uh, when I was thinking about this kind of stuff, and in other conversations that I've had with colleagues, I have I've shared about the importance of Marxist materialist method for students at our university, and uh, I don't know I don't know how receptive folks generally are, but in keeping with the calls of the Plan de Santa Barbara, first and foremost, and in keeping with the calls that are identified in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and certainly in keeping with the impetus and the motivation of the ethnic studies movement, shout out to its leadership throughout the state and nationally, in keeping with this impetus. I think it's important, that that we consider not just the objective conditions of our lives, but the prisms through which the objective conditions of our lives are either occluded, are obscured, or on the other hand, right, the ways in which these prisms might be cleaned, the surfaces might be cleaned so that we can understand ourselves. And for me, this is really a very exciting and a very interesting and very necessary proposition. I'm going to stop for just a second to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I think you're gonna have a lot of trouble trying to get people to adopt a Marxist kind of lens within the academy, including the Marxists.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the reason, I mean, you have a lot of difficulty trying to get people to have a material examination of reality. In the same way that you're going to have, an education system within the capitalist system is there to prop up capitalism, right? So, in the same way that the judicial system produces people who throw people in jail, right? You have an education system that's designed to train people to get to work, right, and not ask too many questions. So even people with professed Marxism, they can't really practice, or they don't for the most part practice a historical materialist kind of examination of things. They'll
Yeah.
start adding a bunch of words in front of capitalism. They'll start adding a bunch of words in front of the analysis. They'll add a bunch of words in front of essentially what is historical materialism, which is to apply a historical materialist lens to any issue of the day, right? So it's like, okay, so what is the economic driver of this? Okay, so when did this begin? Okay, how did it develop? Okay, what time was that? Okay, and start taking in like these informations the way a detective would, right? So essentially what it is, I mean, essentially what it is, it's a forensic reading of history, right? So why did this happen? Who
Yeah.
was involved? Who benefited from it? And who continues to benefit from it, and um, and who continues to tell lies because they are benefiting, right? So, what can you trust and what can't you trust? And so that's applying a historical materialist lens to any type of field of and any question of the day. And when you try to do that, or when you do that, it's going to lead to answers that um, really call for the restructuring society, and therefore the ending of your job. I mean, and it becoming something else, and your expertise becoming something else in a part of a different society that could, where your expertise would be would plug into society in a very different, in a radically different manner, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But to do that within this existing society is to take your fate in your hands, right? So most people won't do that. The system in place, so that's for people that are not like just openly duplicitous and opportunist and cowardly, etc.
Yeah.
Which are minority. Then you have what the system actually incentivizes, and what the system actually incentivizes, particularly within the humanities, is a series of just backbiting and disqualification of other people in order to get that little piece of cheese that belongs to me and only me, and for
Yeah.
this set given reasons, and therefore shut up, and therefore
Yeah.
you're not qualified, and therefore this is mine, not yours, and therefore a lot of therefores, right? That are very honed on the individual as to why they are uniquely qualified to do a thing. Now that could be a resume, that could be based on who they are, they could be all kinds of different things. That could be like having the signature of somebody else, having networks, essentially guilds, all these kinds of different things that Marx described elsewhere. But that's going to be very, very difficult. And so I think that's it's kind of like when we look at the struggle. I mean, there's reasons why it's such a struggle to really just speak the truth and have a platform for, or as best we can even to speak the truth that there is a truth, and then try and
Yeah.
try and find it and try and find its origin, and then try and confront this unjust world that we live in at its at its center point, at the thing that is springing out
Yeah.
all these other things. Yeah, you're gonna get stopped in your tracks. I think that's gonna happen. You're
It's
not.
it's it's uh there's a couple words that I'm really interested in including in our conversation this morning, in this hour. And there are two words that I've introduced before. And the words, of course, are the word ontology and the word epistemology. But before we get into that, I just want to share that one of the things that I've been very interested to do as far as the work that I've done over the many years that I've been an educator is to provide students with an opportunity to not only see and understand the relationships between base and superstructure, right, at the local and regional level, but for them to also recognize that the time that they are in the classroom is not divorced from their communities at all. The classroom, in fact, is the real world. The classroom is a place where we prepare them and not only prepare them for their inclusion in the real world, right? But as a reflection and as it fits in the real world, it reproduces the tensions and the antagonisms, the difficulties and the responsibilities that exist outside of the classroom. They reproduce themselves in the context of the classroom, and then the socialization that takes place in the classroom within that context functions to acclimate and prepare students for their lives once they leave this particular way station. And so this makes me think then not just about the algebra in chapter 11, but it makes me think about the difficulties with which we confront the algebra in chapter 11 in relation to categories that are useful for understanding our very existence, categories that are useful for understanding our lives as workers in this economy. What's up with that? I think about that. One of the things that I've shared with my colleagues throughout the length of my educational career is that effectively, we have always been in the world, right? And students have always been in the world with us. And this existence is shaped by the historical conditions of our lives. however stratified our lives are, right? Where we're on top and they're on the bottom in the context of the classroom. Some people are from one social and economic category in the classroom, and other people are from a different social and economic category in the classroom. And that these categories create the divisions and normalize the divisions, reproduce the divisions, right, along racial and economic lines, for instance. And so effectively, as educators, we function as gatekeepers, right? We function as gatekeepers when we're not thinking about what we're doing. And to that extent that we misrecognize our tasks as gatekeepers in these way stations, we, as the gatekeepers, right, function to reproduce, extend the objective conditions of students' lives, and at the same time, work to blind them, when we're not thinking, and when we are blind ourselves, blind them to those objective conditions. It really is a complicated task. It's much more than simply teaching students how to read and write, what it is we are doing. We are teaching students, when we're not thinking about what we're doing, we're teaching them to acclimate, to quote unquote, be resilient. I'm uncomfortable with that word. I like the word resist. I like your cap, for instance, right? It makes me think about, these kind of things. And
Yeah.
it makes me think about, who we are,
Yeah.
within the context of these things.
Well, but the thing about it, sometimes, it's not always helpful to move around the world and see different things. It's not always helpful to like come up with all these cross comparisons, because it begins to drown out like the specifics of things, especially if it's a under discussed factor in the place you live in, right? But I'm going to do it anyways, right?
Yeah.
So there's an Iranian film called, I believe it's called The Taste of Cherry.
The
And
Taste of Cherry?
Taste of Cherry, and it's a beautiful film. It's about this man, and he's driven to end it all. He's driven to kill himself, and he picks up these hitchhikers, and he tells them their plan, and they all try to get the fuck away from him, right? But one of the people he picks up is a soldier, right? And the soldier tells him, in the course of the conversation, that he's Kurdish, right? And he tells him in the middle of the conversation what he plans to do, and the boy kind of freaks out. He's a teenager, he's very young, and he looks to him and he says, like, well, you're a Kurd, you're supposed to be, a Kurd has to be tough, right?
Mm.
Now that is something I'm very familiar with, right? And I'm not Kurdish, right? But I come from a group of people who are told in this country, you're Mexican, you gotta be tough, and I can imagine someone who wasn't, right? And so this guy who's telling us this Kurdish, Iranian,
Mm.
this Iranian Kurdish descent, this Kurd living in Iran, subject to Iran, right? That he has to be tough because he is Kurdish, right? And so there's a category that like he exists in, and there is an expectation of resiliency, of grit, of toughness that he must play and not betray, right? Otherwise, he's no true Kurd, right? And so like that kind of category, that subcategory, that I don't want to say subcategory, but that category of human being of you must be tough, or a fill in the blank must be tough, exists throughout the world, right? And so since it exists throughout the world, there must be a common set of conditions that spring them forth, right? And what is that common set of conditions? What happened to the Kurds, right? What have happened to the Chicanos? What happens to people? What happened to to the African American? What has happened to all to people that are oppressed throughout the world, to groups of people who are quote unquote marginalized? I don't like that. I don't like that term, but I mean, but like, who are these? What happens, right? And so there are a certain set of conditions, and they're unique and they're different from each other throughout the world. But there are a certain set of commonality, and there's and the constant refrain from all of them is that they must show grit, they must be tough, they must strong it out, and then there is virtue in this thing that they have to overcome, that they are born into.
You know, I'm thinking about, as I hear you speak, there's a phrase in Spanish, and it's not a particularly noble one, but it speaks to what you're talking about. And the phrase is, if one is speaking to a man, is aguántate cabrón, aguántate cabrón, you know, like, you know, accept it, you're tough. You know, I guess that's the less vulgar way of translating the phrase, you know, accept it, you're tough. And so it speaks to, it speaks to, you know, the promotion of a resilience where the assimilation and the assimilation is such that the conditions into which one is assimilated are untouched, you know, and it's a praise. You know, I think earlier in our discussion over these last months, Matt, one of the things that I mentioned was other, you know, there's a Chicano version of the same quote or the same saying, and the Chicano version of this particular phrase is, you know, first name Manuel, last name Labor, right? And so that one either says that statement, one either introduces that particular statement or that phrase in conversation to laugh at one's condition or to critique one's condition, right? I think that to the extent that one is laughing to one's condition, you know, there's an uncomfortable space there, right? That the condition is left untouched, that the condition of our existence, the condition of our work, the conditions of our work are neutral, are as they are, and somehow are ahistorical, and that it is our task, right, to commit to them.
Yeah.
We are, after all, Mexican.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, but my prescription to the problem is that all labor must be exalted. You know what I'm saying? Like, my solution would be like the national liberation stuff, and also, you know, being, you know, and the affirmation of dignity, human dignity, et cetera,
Yes.
et cetera. But a part of all that must be all labor must be exalted.
Yeah.
It can no longer be an insult to be a maid. It can no longer be an insult to be a janitor. It can no longer be an insult to be thought of, you know, as a paletero or something like that. It can never, like, no section of human labor is to be looked down upon, right? So therefore, it would not, you know, and all labor should be compensated.
Yeah.
And all labor should, you know, and all workers, all power to all the workers, right? But that's really what needs to happen, because so long as there are stations of labor that can be, you know, so long as there are stations of labor that will be exploited at human levels, so long as there are stations of labor that will whatever, in the United States of America, we will fill them, and Iran, the Kurds will fill them, in you know, like in various nations of Africa, other poor African nations will fill them. In the UAE, the Pakistanis, Indians, and Filipinos will fill them. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's always going to be like that kind of thing. So long as there are like just inhuman stations of labor, the victims of conquest, or the victims of commerce, or the victims of conquest in between, you know what I'm saying, within Mexico itself, you know, the more indigenous will fill them. You know what I mean? Within, you know, it goes on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
Central Americans will film within Mexico, and within Central American countries, Hondurans will work in El Salvador, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just keeps going, right? So like, so really, the kernel is that all, you know, the kernel part of all of it is that all labor, I mean, one of the things that must happen, I mean, in addition to all these other aspects, because life isn't just work, right? All these things in life that we need to fix and amend and have, you know, some real, you know, some real truth about, and go through the process of fixing and changing and restructuring. That's all true too. But one of the things is that no labor can be diminished anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the difficulties that I've confronted even before I was a university professor was um, to speak about um, the act of teaching as work, um, uh, not unlike, at least theoretically, not unlike the work that other people do in other places and in other spaces in the community. Somehow there is this notion that the work of teaching, the work of speaking in a classroom, the work of teaching people how to read and write, for instance, is somehow beyond the beyond conventional labor relations. And so the task is the task to shed light on the reality of teaching as work, wherever it is that one happens to exercise it, be that in a preschool classroom, a primary school classroom, et cetera, a university classroom, et cetera, wherever it is that one happens to do this work, the task is challenging to convince one's colleagues that one is in that moment laboring, right, in, as Marx says, a sausage factory. But we'll talk about that later on. I need to say that I came to this set of thoughts, things that we're thinking in this particular moment and giving voice to in this particular moment. I came to this kind of epiphany, for lack of a better term at the moment, because I've read various biographies about Che Guevara, and the ones that are especially informative in terms of Che Guevara's life as a as an instructor, as an educator, are the Cuban biographies. Interviews of people that lived and worked and fought with Che Guevara. Often illuminate the importance and the necessary attention that he gave, not just to literacy work, fundamental literacy work, but to the advancement of more extended and sophisticated levels of literacy. And within that kind of development was his admonishment that his soldiers, that the Cuban people and other people, the people that he fought with and for whom he also fought, master algebra. And for me, when I initially read such lines, it always surprised me. And then, of course, I came to understand, especially now that we've been doing this reading, I came to understand why, right? Why it's so important to understand the relationships, between and across various sets of ratios that could be understood in variable form, in abstract form, and that could be quantified so that folks that know algebra could come to conclusions about shared conditions, shared variables across geography, across space, and then not just learn some set of methods, but really learn to apply those methods to the objective conditions of their lives, conditions that are shared, as you note, Matt, as much here in Los Angeles, as they may be shared by folks in the United Arab Emirates, as they might be shared by folks in Italy, as they might be shared by folks in Mexico, right? That there's an objective set of conditions that could be understood algebraically, and this is very important. This is very important. And our challenge is the same challenge taken up by Marx, promoted by Che, which is, to master algebra.
Yeah. And the mastery of algebra will in a way allow, and I haven't mastered algebra, but the mastery of algebra will help you understand what we commonly refer to as like the nuts and bolts, the nitty gritty,
Yeah.
the real, you can understand if you. I mean, it's kind of like to know that you're being exploited, or to know that you're being taken advantage of, to know that
Yeah.
man, this system is not, this is rigged against me. Is kind of like knowing how
Yeah.
to, it's like knowing how to drive a car, right? You know, to put the key in the ignition, you know, to hit gas, you know, how to hit the brake, right? But to know algebra, but to know the mathematical formulation of it, well, that's like knowing how to build a car, right? That's like knowing how to like fix your own engine. You know, that's like knowing how to like actually how the car actually works. You know, knowing
Yeah.
the this and that. It's the difference between, you know, like a regular person, you know, feeling sick and knowing their symptoms, and a doctor who has a much better understanding of
Yeah.
what do symptoms mean. You know, because you know, a regular person might get heartburn and think they're having a heart attack.
What are you talking about?
I
Just
don't know. I
what
don't
are
know.
you trying to say?
Random example. But like, but the reality is that like, you know, the symptoms, well, here, you know, here's a piece of information. Here's a piece of useful information for everyone that's not so abstract. You know, the what do you call it? The symptoms of heartburn, severe heartburn, are actually the same as the symptoms for a heart attack. So you might get a left shooting pain in the arm, and it's just because
Yeah.
you ate, you know, some spice. You put too much on your eggs. And that's actually true. So like, you know, so, but, you know, but yeah, so if you're a doctor, you might be aware of that. Whereas if you're not, you might, you know, you
Yeah.
might start, you know, seeing your whole life flash for your eyes. Um, so similarly, to know that you're being taken advantage of is one thing, but to know some of these algebraic equations that Marx came up with in Capital is to kind of know the specifics of it, like how it works, the dynamics of it. But you know what's
Yeah.
interesting to me about this chapter though is that he talks about Spinoza and he talks about Ricardo, who are you know, Spinoza is very well known as a, you know, kind of a philosopher more than you know, someone that would discuss a lot of economy. But Ricardo was definitely known as somebody that was an economist. Um, you know, of course, a proponent of capitalism,
Yeah.
similar to Adam Smith. Um, but what's interesting is that when he talks about them, is they both really kind of, their observation he feels fall flat because what they're looking at is you know, things don't really change and things aren't really what things are just kind of, they're kind of like, well they're very much looking at the world in front of them and saying like, I don't see anything, what are you talking about? Right.
Mm.
and and Marx, he himself says, as at first, capital subordinates labor on the basis of technical conditions in which it historically finds it, does not therefore change immediately the mode of production, the production of surplus value, and hitherto considered by us by means of simple extension of the working day, therefore to be independent of mode of blah 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 blah. But then he says something here later about tanning skins, but he says that, well, he says it earlier. He says something about, he says something about how you know, the dynamics at play in a bakery, in a
Oh yeah. Yeah.
small, are the same as a giant cotton mill, right? And that was mean to say that like these small bakers were able to, they lived off the exploitation of their worker, um, um, in the same way that these giant capitalists live off the exploitation of the workers. And those bakers predate what he describes as the dawn of capitalism, right? So these guilds, these small little things, you know, they exist,
Yeah.
um, not only before you know, before the conquest, you know, of the Western Hemisphere, or the murder and mayhem of the you know, the plunder of the Western Hemisphere, or the transatlantic slave trade. They exist not before the quote unquote rosy dawn of capitalism. They exist in Europe for a long time before that, but they also exist all around the world, right? These small guilds and whatever. And what makes it capitalism is that the entire society is geared around the exploitation of labor and not
Mm.
like a tributary process, right? And so that's kind of how he defined things. But what's interesting to me is that if you look at that, will be the grand takeaway is that the old system, the new system grew up in the old, right? There were aspects of the new system, of the system that we understand, that existed in the previous,
Germinating that. Yeah.
right, that eventually grew out of it and terminated it, right, and overtook it, right? And so similarly today, what's very interesting to me is that Marxists today are the most conservative, I find, ideologically conservative. I don't mean like, I don't mean like bigots or homophobic or anything. I mean like they just like they can't move out of something. They're stuck, right? On the question of automation. It typically is people who are the most steep in Marx who will say the capitalists would never do that, and this would never happen, and that could never happen. Labor is the sole source of profit, and they would never cut their own feet off. They would never do this. They would never do that. Blah blah blah. Blah. And yet, when you look outside, you see when you look into the world, you see this thing called the service economy. You see this thing called the gig economy. You see all these things that are reflections of the fact that everything is moving in this direction. That direction is less work, right? And that keeps moving, right? And it's very funny because these people who call themselves Marxists are displaying the type of mentality that Marx was referring to or pointed out in Spinoza and Ricardo, which is to like look at the text you've read and then look at around you. Well, look, that guy over there, he's working. That guy over there, he's working. That person's working. That person's
Yeah,
working. That person's
yeah.
working. And not
Right.
look at where is this thing headed,
Yeah,
right?
it's being blind. It's being blind to reality, you know, and is using established text as the prism through which to understand the world outside. You know, what is missing is, you know, I don't know whom it is that is the object of your critique in this particular moment, but you know, leaving these folks aside for the moment and just thinking about the critique that you're making in and of itself. You know, it seems to me that what you are observing is that there are folks that don't quite understand not just what is outside of them, you know, outside of their front door or wherever it is that they happen to be, but there's this concept of dead labor that they seem to miss in their conceptualization of their world. It seems as if, you know, to speak it just a bit metaphorically, it seems to be that that they don't see the zombies, you know, approaching. Again, I don't know who it is you're talking about, you know, but you know,
Well,
the
I would say
observation
it's
is
not
valid
it's not
and
like an
important.
individual critique. It's really kind of, I mean, it really is the majority of people who would refer themselves as Marxists or refer themselves as
Yeah,
historical materials. The wide majority.
yeah,
It's not even it's not an individual person. It's the wide majority. I mean, you have certain things like in England with the luxury communists, and Verso is putting out a lot of books like kind of raising this question, but these people typically I don't think represent organizations. Maybe they do, and I just don't know.
yeah,
But for the most part, there's a real stodginess around this that you wouldn't find um, from the average person, that you wouldn't find from uh, uh, just someone who might be studying a different field. That you know what I'm saying? But
yeah,
like people who are steeped in having read these texts are often the most resistant to this idea that that is possible, that a change in the means of production will eventually shift the mode of production, which
yeah,
is really almost the most, which is one of the most reoccurring themes of Marx's entire, you know, collection of writings.
yeah, yeah. You know, uh, I want to get into the mitigating factors, the tension and the dialectic, uh, as I come to understand it in this chapter, uh, where on the one hand there is necessary labor and labor power, and on the other hand there is surplus labor and surplus value. Right? I'd like to talk about that. And we're at about 15 minutes. I can't believe the conversation is gone so, you know, these last 45 minutes have gone so quickly. It's just that I think I want to close this particular section by saying that it is my heartfelt belief, right, that students ought to master, you know, this grammar, the logic, the inductive and deductive reasoning, the algebra in Capital. That it's important that they master it. It's their right to master it in the face of all the forces throughout the educational pipeline that would keep them from mastering this stuff, especially now, you know, with so much implosion in communities and schools, even in families, etc. There's so much implosion. And without this prism, this implosion will not only not be understood, but students and people in the community in general will be sucked into it as well, kind of a whirlwind, right? And they will be sucked into this implosion. And I think that one of the ways to keep this from happening is for us to be attentive to it, so that we can be resistant to it. Anyways, let's see what we can do in these last 10, 15 minutes or so that are left to us, Matt. I'd like to talk about what is basic to this chapter. And of course, on my screen is just my image and your image, and then some things that I have here for notes for our discussion. So I don't know if folks are stating things or posing questions. I don't know. So
yeah, there are, but like that's why I like the BeLive system better, because you can see them on the side.
Yeah, and I can't see it here. So
this looks a lot crisper and cleaner, but like Zoom is a lot harder to use.
Yeah,
For this purpose.
yeah.
And BeLive always like fades out, so there's problems with BeLive as well.
Yeah.
In terms of keeping up with questions and commentary, BeLive is a far superior system.
Yeah, well, I thank everybody. I don't know who you are. I thank folks who are participating, making comments. I'm sure some folks that have been with us since the beginning are still with us. I thank you, and I welcome anybody that's new or relatively new. And I will try at this point, at the beginning of the academic year, to get to some of these things. But I may not be as good as I had been over the summer, so please forgive me. It's not because I'm inattentive. It's because I'm, I've got my hat hanging in a bunch of different places. So it would be on that account. Anyway, so for us to understand then the relationships that lead to the accumulation of surplus value. Of course, as we've been stating all along, it's important that we understand the algebra and that we understand how the increase or decrease in one set of categories, right? The categories of necessary labor and labor power, that these have a corresponding effect if the goal is to increase surplus value, that these have a corresponding effect on surplus labor, right? So that this tension, this divide, this dialectic, right, is mitigated when capital controls the dialectic, is mitigated by technology, such that capital's capacity to figure each of these categories as either variable capital or constant capital is going to facilitate the capitalist pursuit of surplus value. I know that what I've said sounds very jargonistic. I wonder how you might help to make it plain. What do you think?
Can you say that again?
Well, there are two categories, right? And these categories are in tension with one another, but it's a tension that is controlled by capital, right? Within the context of the capitalist system, where where the capitalists are at the levers of society, this tension is controlled such that the capitalist and the capitalist system can generate surplus value, can quote unquote generate profit, right? And so the capitalist system and the capitalist needs to mitigate between, on the one hand, necessary labor and labor power, things that the capitalist himself or the capitalist herself is not entirely able to monopolize. And then the capitalist and the capitalist on the other hand also needs to mitigate the relationship between these two things on one side and surplus labor, abstract labor, right? Needs to calibrate these relationships, much as a mechanic, the mechanic of old, calibrates the carburetor, the relationship between oxygen and fuel in order to get combustion, right? That the capitalist is calibrating these relationships in order to get, a twofold return on his investments in the capitalist system. And I was wondering if you could shed light or speak to this.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, so there's certain negotiations the capitalists have to make. It's all mathematics. I mean, there's certain negotiations they have to make with the workers themselves because they are in a world of competition with other capitalists, right? So if other capitalists can incentivize a certain pay level, right? Then they can, hire the people they need to create the products they want to sell them on the market, right? And so if they have what's called like competitive, competitive pay, they're more likely to incentivize the labor force they need, right? So the capitalist is always in like kind of negotiation with this larger market with the market of labor itself, right? But no matter what, the capitalist can never pay the worker what they're actually producing, because if they were to do that, it would just no longer be capitalism, and that would it would defeat its own purpose, and that's not how we do things. I mean, that's not how capitalism works. So they always have to earn pay. So even if you're being paid well, the reason you think it's well, or the reason you think you're being compensated fairly, is only because it's in comparison to other wage levels. Because what the capitalist actually thrives on, what the capitalist lives on, is your surplus labor. They take what is called your surplus labor, so your necessary labor. See, necessary labor might sound like, oh, what is the labor necessary to build the cup? That's no. What is meant by it? And it's kind of a confusing term, so I don't know if he should have said it this way, but it is it's what he said, and it's what it means. Yeah. Necessary labor is the labor that you do to keep yourself alive. I mean, that's the amount of wages you receive to keep yourself, to keep you as an individual alive, right? So your necessary labor is, let's say you make I don't know how much, $300 a week, right? And you actually in 10 hours produce $300. That was your necessary labor. That $300 that you received, that was what you produced in 10 hours. Now you got a 40-hour work week. That means the rest of 30 hours is surplus labor. Yeah. And that's what the capitalist is keeping themselves, right? And so and that is the basis of capitalism. And no matter where you work, you are never paid what you produce. Yeah. Or else you get fired. I mean, or else the business goes out of business. I mean, unless it's like a small business where it's a startup and someone's that, and somebody's coming out of their own pocket and they're just acting all, just like zany or whatever, you're not going to get paid. Target's not going to pay you as much as the value you bring to Target. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be as big as Target. It could be a smaller company than that. It could be just a franchise that's got like 7 restaurants. Clearly that guy knows what he's doing. And by knowing what he's doing, he knows how to exploit labor. That's why he has 7 stores.
Yeah. And so that there is an algebraic formula in order to understand this, right? So that the investments that the capitalist makes in terms of payment for necessary, for labor power, right? That the capitalist seeking to extract labor power from labor makes a set of concessions, or when things are working in the capitalist's favor, right? Extracts from labor extracts from labor power that corresponds to the conditions and the existing rates of exploitation. These are things that I've been reading about, throughout these readings that we've been doing, Matt, in Kapital, and are crystallizing in my consciousness and crystallizing in my understanding as far as not just the working world, outside of my front door, as it were, but the working world in which I find myself, and the working world in which the people that I'm in communication with also find themselves. And of course, given the context of my working world, right, those people are either faculty members or students themselves.
Well, the one last thing I wanted to say on that topic though is we find it seems every few years, maybe every like I don't know, maybe like once or twice a decade, put it that way.
Yeah.
It comes time to expose celebrities who are making their clothing lines in sweatshops, right? So I remember Kathy Lee Gifford was the first big one, right? And then not too long ago, Beyonce, and a few other people,
Oh yeah.
and there's some debate about this. And the thing that's always said in defense of people who are using sweatshops is they try to find the prevailing rate of pay in that country, and they say, look, Bangladeshi labor is making is on average $1.17 a day, and I'm paying them 3. So come on, I'm doing these people a favor, right? And that is the mentality of capitalism, right? And people who are fans of, say, Kathy Lee Gifford or of Beyonce or of whoever, right,
Yeah.
Are not fans of them for their exploitative labor practices. They're fans of them for other reasons. But because they're fans of them for other reasons, they will defend their exploitative labor process. So that's like the mentality that people have, right? The mentality people have. These are not other capitalists. These are workers. These are workers who themselves have experience exploitative labor practices, because all capital um, relations are exploitative labor practices.
Yeah.
So they don't experience the same rate of exploitation. They enjoy a higher standard of living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they are subject to capitalist exploitation. And yet, because they are entrenched in the system, and because there is aspects of life that are entertaining and bedazzling and befuddling, they will defend capitalist exploitation for some reason or another. I mean, look at the cult around some of the people that are seen as like people that drive history forward. Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, the
Yeah. I remember when he was passing away, all the hoopla around, his life, and all the expressions and extensions of Amor and
right. And but I mean, think about like Thomas Edison. I mean, centuries after he's dead, it's like think different. Him and imagining with a light bulb, right? This is a guy that electrocuted an elephant for a publicity stunt. Steve Jobs is a guy who had people committing suicide assembling his phones. So I mean, these are not people to be admired. And yet, because of the innovations of the iPhone and because of the innovations of the light bulb, we accept, or we think this, well,
if not ignore.
it's just not, it's not important. I mean, but not, I mean, no, but I mean, but there's nothing unique to the phone or to the light bulb. There's nothing inherent in the technological technological development that demands the exploitation of labor. What demands the exploitation of labor is the greed of capitalists.
Yeah.
Is that individual is a system? It's not individual, but it is the individual greed and individual people doing individual things, but it's also the systematic setup.
The integration and the penetration of the system in the lives of the people that are at the levers of history. Absolutely. Hey, Matt, we're at the tail end, and I've got other things. You know, the semester has begun. I want to thank you. And of course, as we typically do, I'd like to extend my thanks and appreciation. I'll get back to folks who have chimed in just as soon as I have a few moments. And then finally, Matt, would you bring closure? Would you bring poetic
All right. So I promised last week that I would get this thing done. I promised 2 weeks ago that I would get this done for, I gave you a preview to the whole thing, and I have a draft, so I'm not sure this is going to be the final version, but here we go. This is a Molotov tossed towards Camelot. This is Paradise 1. The rise of the sixth sun. This is myth, that is legend, a sense of direction when you can't trust your senses materially. Historic and dialectic, mysterious until it isn't, it is written. For now, past, present, and future generations count 7. This and that shit. They don't knock it till you try it. Today's hypothesis, tomorrow's science, which remains the same, state of constant change, a fit of rage, and jilted state, and a gilded age. The spark that lights the flame. These decades made days. The risks sound ridiculous. That post-industrial proletariat spitting back through knowledge, eat the rich. History will absolve us. The city was built against us. Always was. Even now, as the city shoots up, the law crashes down from the hanging courts, the peerless jury, the sitting judge. The city is out for blood. Look right, look left. Bands of armed men pledge to turn orders to one another, answer only to the call of death. In fire and memory, the city's walls rebel, tell tales of a time when the people rose, though long ago and somewhere else. Pride is the compromise of public life struck by those who serve in the killers of time. The devourers of light, parasites, the city rides by night, runs off the sweat of the backs of those who work it, laying their brick that walls them off, then off the stuff the pockets of those who work them. The city's a field. Labor is the crop. As one building crumbles and scrapes the sky. Planners call it beautification and blight. Ink bleeds, a cartography of hypocrisy and lies. Every next day's headline reads, a poor mother's nightmare and a rich man's dream. The tale of all too many cities is a shame. There was no other way. After careful consideration and internal investigation, the city finds no fault within itself. Tragic, inevitable, regrettable, but justifiable. It's another day, another page, and the slain of the shot in the back of the hands of death squad. The city is awash with tears to tale, to die on your feet, but parable by any means. Trajectory of a Molotov tossed towards the break of dawn by prayer and proverb. Tonight, Camelot burns, into the fire the city bursts. Over the ash, chants and commands converge. Through the smoke, the hour of the tire iron emerges. Wood, aluminum, lead, as the night set would contest the cityscapes, the barricades, the gavel and batons relinquished claim. A brick shattered the chapel of print, cracked the mint, the news broke, the armory fell, the coin crashed. Commerce was pulled from the streets, ideology ripped from concrete, the means were seized by the hands of need, then laid claim to provisions, then burnt the money because the money was worthless. The signs of intersections vanished by popular decree of the People's Republic, whosoever was standing on the corner. That night in Camelot, dreams roam free. His eyes would meet for the first time unleashed, their tongues so long commodified for a lifetime, none could describe what had never been known. In all its plan, chaos and bloodshed, the law crashed in from all directions. Another rebellion was cleared by dawn. Yet all that are remembered is not lost. Long live the hymn of the brick, pulled from the city's wall. The psalm of the flame that awaits the spark. The choir of Molotovs that one night in Camelot lit our way through the fog. This is myth that is legend. A sense of direction when you can't trust your senses materially, historic and dialectic, mysterious until it isn't. It may take generations. It may have already begun.
The hymn of the brick.
Hymn of the brick.
Did you give us the title of that poem?
Camelot.
Camelot. Vinci Matt. The poet. All right. Well, thank you. Wow. Can't wait to read it. That's what I want to do. I mean, it's moving. I can't wait to read it. Yeah. I've read portions of it. I think in stuff that you've sent me. I recognize some phrasing there, and there's things there that I don't remember. Forgive me if I should remember, but anyway, what really caught my attention was the language around before and after the phrase, the hymn of the brick. That's loved it. Okay, folks, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. All right, we'll continue. After this, of course, we've just finished chapter 11. We've done all of the last part of the book, which is a great collection of stuff. And we've read all the way now through to chapter 11. We've got some chapters to go, but this has been a very exciting set of readings that we've been doing. However crumbling the city has been, Matt.
We're close to completion, so we'll see you next week.
All right, wonderful.